Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this edition of the post-budget speech discussion. You would have seen in the invite that we were going to host Mr. Multiplier. I'd like to just apologize on his behalf. He was not able to join us this evening. However, we still have a very exciting speaker whom I'll introduce a bit later. I just wanted to maybe just start off the discussion with this. A quote from Barack Obama, who says, "A budget is more than just a series of numbers on a page. It's an embodiment of our values." So for me, I think I found that quite interesting, because really where you know in your personal life, where you spend your money also just is an indication of what's important to you, where and how you spend your money. So while this budget really had encouraging items like the tourism equity fund, the allocation there, and the budget allocated to the small business development department for township economic development, there's still some questions that I certainly have on a personal level, and that I hope that Mr. Kibule will help us to unravel. I mean, really, one of the major questions is really how are we going to change the long-term economic development of South Africa? It's not clear that this budget is really going to do that for us. So we're hoping that Duma will give us, a view in terms of his opinion on whether the budget will get us there, and perhaps maybe a few words of advice in terms of what the government could do differently. I mean, I say this at the back of your article a few days ago around government must shelf plans for austerity measures. So we're really looking forward to hearing your opinion. So ladies and gentlemen, there's lots to discuss today. I'm going to just delve straight into giving, just giving you a brief profile of our speaker, Mr. Duma Kibule. He's a friend of the BMF, so he really needs no introduction. However, I just thought that I wanted to do this. I wanted to just remind you that he's recognized, he has been recognized and has worked in the BE Empowerment BE Commission, which was chaired by President Cyril Ramaphosa. And he's a co-author of the Commission's landmark report, which paved the way for the country's current Black economic empowerment policies. He's also editor of Making Mistakes, Righting Wrongs, Insights into Black Economic Empowerment, which reviewed the country's economic development and transition policies during the first decade of democracy. He is a business columnist and a prominent public speaker and commentator on issues related to the economic development and transition of the country. So we really, really have somebody who's very knowledgeable, who has over time studied and the economy and really knows what it is that we need to do if we as a country say that we are a state that wants to develop. So ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Mr. Multiplier to say opening remarks.
And thank you for the, am I on mute? Thank you very much for the introduction. Yeah, as you're talking about BE, nowadays I don't talk a lot about BE, but I've become more focused on broader issues of economic development. But I just have to mention that I just did a paper recently for Wits University, Southern Center for Economic Inequality Studies, where I look at the ownership transactions, and I got very tired of these fake statistics that you're seeing on Black ownership on the JSE, and it's going through academic review, and I can tell you right now, the Black ownership on the stock exchange is about 1.7%. Anyway, you'll see the report when it eventually comes out. So let me just start with my presentation. And I need to share my screen, sorry. I forgot to do that. Ooh. Okay, thank you so much. A lot of you read the newspapers and you follow business media about economic debates. And the Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, she talked about the danger of a single narrative. She was talking about it in a different context, but I think this is very important in the field of economics. Some years ago, I was a judge in the Old Mutual budget competition, where I think honors or students, economic students, submit an essay. And this essay was about savings and investment. And I must say that 90% of most of the students gave only one view of the relationship between savings and investment. But there are different views on the issue of savings and investment. And I had to mark them wrong because they were giving one particular view and there are many other views. So anyway, so in South Africa, there's the neoliberal or neoclassical view that totally dominates debates on the economy. And you hear about structural reforms and austerity. You can't, if you ask someone what are structural reforms, how are they going to grow the economy? Nobody can tell you exactly how they're going to grow the economy. But let me tell you right now, I read every single budget, and over the past decade and more, National Treasury says in every budget that structural reforms do not deliver growth in the short term. They deliver growth in about 5 years. So we are in a crisis right now. It is not the time for structural reforms. I'm not saying they're not relevant, but I'm saying right now, in terms of the immediate crisis, they're not going to help us. And then there was an economist called Keynes. He invented macroeconomic policy and the use of counter-cyclical tools, fiscal and monetary policy to stimulate aggregate demand. I'm a Keynesian, an old-fashioned Keynesian. But as I got to study economics, I began to understand, you know, Keynes wrote for rich countries in the West, like where I went to university in Scotland, where you just use the interest rate and you use the government spending to stimulate the economy. But once I got to re-educate myself, I discovered that many developing countries, particularly in East Asia, they went further than Keynes, and this is where the heterodox economists, it's a post-Keynesian school, they bring attention to a wider range of microeconomic policy tools that can be used to achieve macroeconomic policy objectives. And then there's a new kid on the block. There's a book by Stephanie Kelton called The Deficit Myth. She is the poster girl of, she has taken modern monetary theory to the mainstream. She's in Bloomberg, she was advisor to Bernie Sanders, economic advisor. So modern monetary theory, I welcome it because it confirms what I've always believed, that they break down the artificial separation between monetary and fiscal policy. The Reserve Bank is just an agent of the government. It is there to serve the people of the country. And then modern monetary theory also embraces many Keynesian principles. A national budget is not the same as a household or a company budget. A household does not issue the currency it spends. A household has an independence between income and spending, as the Greek economist Yanis Varoufakis says. And when a country spends, it increases its income. When it cuts spending, it reduces its income. So that is why we have to understand that too often we are seeing an accounting static analysis of how the economy works, but the economy does not work like you see in accountancy. So now, what is it? I've been studying this for a very long time. Is what is it that makes countries successful? Countries that are successful have a mobilizing vision and plan. I've looked at China, Malaysia, Japan, South Korea. On our continents, there's countries like Rwanda and Ethiopia. They have a mobilizing vision and plan that mobilizes society around a common set of objectives. And they don't have to be many objectives, but they have to be clear. You have a long-term plan, a 30-year plan, and it's chunked into 5-year plans. And I would just Google Growth and Transformation Plan Ethiopia, and you'll see it's 5-year plans, and then there's annual plans. Now, we had something called the National Development Plan 9 years ago. Only last year did they review the plan. But a national development plan, a national development plan is a living document that is altered every single year and every 5 years to meet its objectives. These countries had the state capacity to initiate growth and develop, they had high rates of capital formation, between 35% and up to 50% of GDP in the case of China recently. They had spectacular achievements in terms of human development in education and health. I just have to mention South Korea, man. I always mention this because it's got a similar population as South Africa. I also happen to be addicted to South Korean K-dramas. But anyway, so about 70% of the population between 18 and 35 has got a tertiary qualification. In South Korea, 90% of young people between the ages of just below 24 are in a tertiary institution, 90%. That is one of the highest in the world. In South Africa, the tertiary enrollment rate for Black Africans, the last time I looked, was 15%. And they had also spectacular achievements in terms of national health. And if you look at the COVID response, South Korea and Japan have a national health insurance system, and you get free treatment and but there is private provision of the services, but the only buyer of health service is the government. And this was one of the features why they could mobilize society. It's a favorite topic of mine, is how the Asian countries also managed to conquer what's it called, COVID, without vaccines, and they implemented certain policies to bring it under control. They had prior experience in terms of MERS and also SARS, MERS in 2015 and SARS in 2003, but I won't really talk about that. They also had industrial upgrading. This is about the transformation of your economy from agriculture to industry to services. I've been on 2 study tours of China in recent years, and I'm really sad that I haven't been last year because of COVID. There's a conference of African academics who go to China and study their economy. Now they're talking about green development. They're saying that, our previous model of development, it polluted the environment. People in Beijing, they wear masks. And they're taking a radical move towards green development, and they call it the lush development in the Chinese language. And they're also a huge emphasis on technology. I remember going to the Silicon Valley of China in Beijing, and it was an incredible experience. The incubators they have, and the unicorn companies that they have that were developed on that street in Beijing. It was quite an amazing experience. So one thing I've learned about the Chinese, because I've studied a lot about the Chinese, is that they never had one model of development. They had many models of development over the past 40 years, and they chopped and changed them. People talk about policy certainty. No, when something doesn't work, you discard it very quickly. And I could go through many examples of how Chinese, they adopted a policy, it works, then it doesn't work, then they change it with ruthless efficiency. Then in terms of macroeconomic policy, they use, as I was saying, a wider range of policy tools than Keynes. They have multiple tools. The exchange rate, many of them kept their currencies artificially weak. So when you saw Chinese imports flooding Africa, it was because of the weak exchange rate. But we must remember that Japan, South Korea, they also manipulated their exchange rate to support their export industries. State control of finance is very important in all these Asian tigers. You have seen it in Ethiopia, where you see that most of the development in Ethiopia has been financed by the state-owned bank, which has the majority of deposits in the country. They also have different tools like reserve requirements, how much reserves you must keep as a bank, and that is used to stimulate. So there's different reserve requirements for different sectors of the economy. They've got capital controls. You don't allow money to just get in and out of the country. They've got what we call prescribed assets, where you must invest 10% in housing today, or 20% and so forth. And they've got credit quotas and differential interest rates. They've also got multiple targets and multiple objectives: inflation, unemployment, growth, and sectors. So inflation targeting, our policy, 1 tool target and 1 tool, I believe, is primitive and not appropriate for our level of development. So there was close cooperation of monetary, fiscal, and industrial policies. It is one thing. It has implications for the mandate and independence of central banks. I must just mention, the last time I was in China, the central bank introduced a tool to provide lending to small businesses, because the Chinese economy is dominated by large state-owned companies that dominate large sectors of the economy. So their new focus is on stimulating small businesses. So they create a window at the central bank where there's cheap money for you to on-lend on condition that you on-lend it to small businesses. So this is my view that a central bank has a critical role to play in national development. And this is just quick analysis of our economy over the last 20, since our democracy. There's been 4 phases in the post-apartheid economy. If you look, no matter how you look at it, we have performed poorly. No matter, between 1994 and 2019, our GDP per capita grew by 1% a year. So in 2019, which was 28.1% higher than in 1994. China over that period is 760%, and India is 300%. The first post-apartheid period, I go into detail in this in other publications, is that we had the gear policies where there was the slash and burn fiscal policies and cuts in government and cuts in capital spending. There were sky-high interest rates that went up to 22% in 1998. Unemployment doubled to 8 million, almost doubled to 8 million people in March 2003. Sorry, I have to switch this off. In March 2003, from 4.6 million people in 1996. So the broad expanded unemployment rate went to 40.6 from 33%. Now the second period was the boom that we saw between 2004 and 2008. There was a world equities and commodity boom, but my research has shown, and I did a lot of research in mining in a previous life, that we didn't grow because of the commodity boom internationally. What happened there is that our currency appreciated and canceled out most of the benefits of, if you remember that time, our currency was one of the fastest appreciating currencies in the world, and that canceled out the benefits of the world commodity boom. And the Chamber of Mines, the Minerals Council as it's now called, wrote many reports about how South Africa did not benefit from the commodity boom and our GDP did not, So, but we had expansionary monetary and fiscal policies. The interest rates dropped by 650 basis points. There was a consumption boom, there was a property boom, and government spending increased massively. Government investment spending in those times, state-owned companies state-owned companies was growing at about 20% a year plus, and so government consumption and investment spending, the numbers are truly incredible as to how much the government was spending after the end of gear. And that is what lifted the economy. So I'm calling to a return to that type of policy that we had during the post-gear phase. Investment increased to 23.5% of GDP from 16% in 2003. There was no jobless growth. Don't let people tell you that there was jobless growth. We created 3.1 million jobs, and there were 14.8 million people employed in December 2008, from 11.7 million in March 2003. Unemployment rate fell to 28.7% from 40.6%. Then we have, between 2009 and 2019, what I coined the lost decade of economic development. Other people started calling it 9 wasted years, but I'm not going there. So, so the Communist Party has this term which they call the crisis before the crisis. This is the crisis before COVID. We had a crisis of collapsing GDP growth and rising unemployment. During this lost decade, unemployment increased by 4.9 million people to 10.8 million people by March 2020 when the lockdown started. We had a poverty rate of 64% for Black Africans, the upper bound poverty line. We are the most unequal country in the world. We have a Gini for income of 0.63 and for wealth of 0.95. We had 5 years of declining GDP per capita between 2015 and 2019. We had 2 recessions in 2 years, in 2018 and 2019. We had 3 consecutive quarters of declining GDP by March 2020, and we're heading for a 3rd recession in 3 years in 2020. So we had 6 out of 9 quarters of declining GDP and 7 out of 9 quarters of declining investment, despite 3 investment summits where pledges were made of 774 billion rands. and government gazetted projects worth 340 billion rands. I'll talk about that later when I talk about the recovery plan. So we are now what I call the fourth phase of the post-apartheid economy. We are witnessing the shock of a crisis that could eviscerate the dreams of our liberation. At the end of 2020, GDP per capita will be only 17% higher than it was in 1994. We had this crony corona capitalism, the corruption around the PPEs and the food parcels, and this vulgar neoliberalism, an obsession with inflation targets. We were in a depression. By definition, there is too little money chasing too many goods. Why do you care about inflation at that time? There's this obsession with the debt ratio and structural reforms, and I believe that this will impede our recovery. We saw this week that we had an unemployment rate of 47% for Black Africans, 51% for Black African females. The social fabric of our society has been irreversibly scarred. And the UNDP and National Treasury says it could take 5 years until 2024 to reach 2019 levels of GDP. It will take longer to reach the same level of GDP per capita that we had in 2019 because our population is growing at about 1.4% a year. The collateral damage could be with us for the next decade, according to the NIDS Crime Survey. I believe that we're heading for a second lost decade between 2020 and 2030. I just want to show you what happened to jobs. This is one way of slicing the jobs between December 2008 and December 2020. And remember, December 2008 was the high point in terms of the previous crisis, the previous cycle when jobs were increasing. So what you saw is that the labor force has grown from 20.7 million people to 26.179. So it's grown by 5.4 million people. The employment has only increased by 255,000 people. And 5.5 minus 255 is the 5.2 million increase in the number of unemployed people. If you unpack it, you see that the formal sector created 274,000 jobs, informal jobs were 156,000, agriculture was flat, and private households, which is your domestic workers, was down. This is another way of slicing the employment data. We look at sectors. Agriculture was flat, mining was flat, manufacturing was a bloodbath. Most of the jobs that were lost were in manufacturing, 600,000 jobs. Construction, 110, trade, 272, but jobs were created in transport, finance, and community and social services. But I must just say, finance jobs have been decreasing in recent years. So, but this figure shows over a 12-year period, finance jobs. So, now, what was the government's response to this once-in-a-century pandemic? I've been running a campaign that the government must stop using this 500 billion rand stimulus figure that they use all the time. There was no stimulus of 500 billion rands. And I was very happy that in the budget this week, Tito Mboweni did not refer to this 500 billion rand stimulus. But let us show you what was supposed to happen. On budget, there was supposed to be 100 billion rand spent on job creation and SMMEs, grants 50 billion, public health 20, and municipalities 20. So that was supposed to be 190 billion rand through the budget. And then 70 billion rand was tax measures. So that is how you get 260 billion rand. The loan guarantee scheme was 200 billion rands and the UIF was 40 billion rands, and that is 240. So if you add those two, it was 500 billion rands. But from day one, this was not a 500 billion rand stimulus because the president said in his speech that part of the financing of the stimulus will be reprioritization of 130 billion rands. Now, a stimulus refers to new money injected into the economy, so you can't count the 130 as part of the stimulus package. So now, what was the real stimulus? What happened after the supplementary budget? We had on budget above the line, the increase in non-interest expenditure was 36 billion rand. The COVID response was 145 billion rands instead of 190, but of the 145 was offset by 109 billion rand of cuts elsewhere. So the net increase, new money into the economy was 36 billion rand. The tax relief, remember the number was 70, but most of that was tax referrals, which do not result in a loss of income for the revenue service. So that is 44, but the tax cuts were 26 billion. So the government's contribution to the stimulus was 62 billion. The loan guarantee was a disaster, as you know, 17.8 billion. I do not count this as part of the stimulus, but for the purpose of the slide, I have counted it. The banks used the guarantee to shift lending to prime clients. 75% were white. The UIF was one of the successes of this response. We lost 1.4 million jobs since the lockdown until December. I believe the numbers could have been much higher if it wasn't for the 58 billion rands that was paid to 4.5 million people to keep their jobs while they were temporarily employed. I believe, as you've seen in research in other countries of the world, that unemployment did not increase as much as it did during the global financial crisis because other countries had similar schemes to protect workers when they were retrenched. And I just have to mention one, that is one. And then there was so the stimulus, according to me, if I exclude the loan guarantee, was 120.1 billion. But if you include the loan guarantee, it was 137.9 billion. That is 2.7% of GDP, and it's less if you exclude the loan guarantee. Now, the mantra of global stimulus packages is that you must go hard, you must go early, you must go household. Our stimulus did not go household because only 50 billion rand was towards household, and the rest, a lot more, went to like companies, 200 billion and so forth, was meant to go to companies. It has to be equal to the expected shock to the economy, a 7.2% decline in GDP, and it must be spent in the year during which it happens. Now, global stimulus packages were $14 trillion, 16% of global GDP. Compared to ours, which was 2.7% of GDP. So I'll just talk now quickly about the recovery plan that was announced by President Ramaphosa on the 15th of October. He used 19.6 billion rand, a provisional allocation of the 145 that I talked to you about in the supplementary budget that had been provisionally allocated to job creation. So he allocated 12.6 towards the presidential youth employment stimulus, which will create 800,000 jobs by March. They extended the SRD, the Social Relief of Distress Grant, by 3 months, and that cost 6.8 billion rands. Now, you've heard about this infrastructure fund. This fund was first announced in 2018, September, when the president had an address to the nation after we went into a recession during the first 2 quarters of that year. He said there would be a 400 billion rands infrastructure fund, and it would be spent in 3 years. Those of us who know the budget immediately decided that that will not happen. The budget, 5 months later, canceled the fund and they reduced the allocation to 100 billion over 10 years. So the budget 2021, the fund has not had any money until now. And the budget now allocates 4 billion rands, 6 billion rands, and 8 billion rands over the next 3 years, 18 billion rands towards the fund. Now you'll see that the amounts are very small. Each year. Next year, it's 0.8% to GDP. Then the second thing is that the budget allocates 11 billion rands to public employment. The finance minister said 100 billion. There is no 100 billion because if you add the 11 billion and the 12.6 billion, you get 23.6 billion, not 100 billion. 100 billion was the intention. So they've canceled most of that as well. So the government can't talk of a recovery plan because infrastructure-led recovery plan, because Treasury, the budget forecasts a 2.4% decline in fixed investment, and the ANC ETC has forecast 130 billion rand decline. Treasury in the budget this week, they forecast 3.3% GDP growth. I must say, Treasury's forecasts have been wrong every year for the past decade. And I just have to mention as well that for the first time, they modeled 2 additional scenarios. So they've got 3% growth this year if the structural reforms happen, and 1.6% if there are COVID waves. What this means is that many people do not believe that the government will vaccinate 40 million people by the end of 2021. What that means in practice is that we could have a 3rd wave in June, July, and a 4th wave in December, and there could be renewed restrictions on the economy and partial lockdown. So that is why they've modeled a lower growth scenario in case that happens there. So the infrastructure plan does not address a number of issues. The public sector investment strike is a major reason for the decline in total investment since 2015. Investment by general government and state-owned companies collapsed by 22% between 2015 and 2019. They do not explain how the government will reverse this trend and repair the broken balance sheet of the state-owned companies. What I've learned from throughout the world is that private sector investment follows GDP growth. It does not kickstart GDP growth. People are talking about this money, the investment strike by the private sector. No, the government has been in an investment strike. What we saw in 2004 is that the government led the way and the private sector followed. Investment follows GDP growth or demand in the economy. It does not kickstart the economy. That is Keynes 101. So I believe that the government has got too much faith in this blended finance, which has failed internationally. They believe that they can. There's this new fad called blended finance, but investors demand huge subsidies to de-risk investments. And the blended finance international has got low leverage ratios. So the leverage ratio for each rand of public money, how much private sector money do you need? And the leverage ratio for this is very low. You cannot have recovery within the context of austerity budgets. That is an oxymoron. The budget cuts will result in lower GDP growth and lower tax revenues, and allocations to bankrupt SOCs will result in more cuts in the wage bill and infrastructure. So now I believe that, let me just talk a little bit about the budget that we saw. The finance minister said it wasn't an austerity budget. It was an austerity budget if you read all the documents that accompanied it. Non-interest expenditure declines for 3 years by 1.2% a year. The public sector wage bill this is less than the inflation rate. It declines by 1.2% a year. The public sector wage bill declines, is flat at 1.2% a year. Grants, they took, from the public sector wage bill, they cut 145 billion rands. From grants, they cut 36 billion rands, and grants declined by 2.2% a year over the next 3 years. And I just want to say that I was talking on the radio and TV, and I was saying that very few people are benefiting from this budget. I just have to mention first, on the 4th of June, or 4th of February, the president launched a fund for gender-based violence and femicide, where he committed 21 billion rands over the next 3 years. There was no allocation in the budget from what I've looked towards it. And in the SONA, he said it would be 12 billion rands, but I have not seen that allocation in the budget. And I just have to say something about the infrastructure plan before I go back to the budget, is that many of these projects are recycled projects. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors from the Zuma years. Many of the projects that he announced in October's speech, I went onto the websites of those projects. I saw a project, a housing project in Free State that had been launched by President Zuma in 2000. The houses were already built and the houses had already been sold and people were living in the houses. And many of these projects, I don't see the benefit of recycling projects that you have previously announced. The same with the Lanzeria Smart City. It is an old project that has been announced in previous State of the Nation address. So I think we must separate the smoke and the mirrors when we analyze the government spending, the stimulus, and when we analyze the infrastructure investment spend. I looked through many of those projects. There's a project in Durban as well, a huge project. I think it's 27 billion rands. A housing project near Gateway. That project was launched in 2015, the Cornovia project. So I don't think we must watch these smoke and mirrors. And then finally, the stimulus and the allocations towards gender-based violence. Now on the austerity budget, as I said, grants went down by 2.2% a year. Non-interest expenditure, which is the main item we look in terms of how government is spending, is down by 1.2% a year from the consolidated budget. And spending was held static at about 0.7% a year. So it was an austerity budget. And just to move on as to how we can get out of this situation, I believe that there's no way out of this crisis except to spend our way out of this crisis. We have to be creative in terms of how we raise the financing for a proper stimulus to get this economy going. By definition, a recession is that there's too little money in the economy and we have to inject new money into the economy. When you inject new money into the economy, the GDP grows and the debt becomes sustainable. That is how a national budget works. So we've got net loan debt of 3.9 trillion, ESCOM debt of 484, and the road accident fund's got a debt liabilities of about 367. The PIC's got assets of 2.1 trillion, and this is the whole SA Inc. balance sheet. Foreign exchange reserves of 822. And you heard before the budget, people were talking about this cash balances that the government has. It was 290 billion rand and not the 380 billion rand that I think one of the advisory firms talked about. But it was still a significant amount of cash that the government has. I just have to mention that a sovereign state which issues its own currency, as we learned from MMT, cannot fail to meet its obligation in its own currency unless it chooses to do so. In South Africa, we have the unique privilege that 90% of our debt is domestic. I was looking at the Zambian debt crisis. It's incredible. Most of their debt is denominated in foreign currency. And that is called the original sin in terms of finance. We've got 822 billion rands of foreign exchange reserve. It's way above the international benchmark of 3 months. I believe we can easily release some of those foreign exchange reserves into the economy, up to 50%. The Reserve Bank can finance government spending and ESCOM debt at no cost. They can provide financing to the government on favorable terms. There's no reason why the Reserve Bank or the PIC can't say, we give you a loan, you pay us with a payment holiday, you pay us when the economy recovers. Or you say, I give you a loan and I give you a zero coupon loan, you pay it at the end of the payment period, you know? And there's different things that you can do in finance that the government can do. The Reserve Bank can recapitalize the development finance institutions, and it can have developmental windows like the one I was talking to you in China, where banks could lend money to priority sectors under certain conditions. Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about debt to GDP, which is, people are obsessed with this one. The world average debt to GDP ratio, and this is a little bit old, has increased by 14 percentage points to about 99% of GDP. Every country has had exactly the same shock to GDP and tax revenues. Our debt to GDP ratio has increased by 17 percentage points to 80.3% of GDP. In relative terms, we are exactly where we were before the crisis. There is no tipping point at which a rising debt ratio results in economic collapse. The SARB, the South African Reserve Bank, and the PIC can be on standby to purchase government debt on the primary and secondary markets to reduce the cost of capital. Many people say, no, the problem is not the debt, but the cost of capital. But the Reserve Bank and the Public Investment Corporation can be more aggressive and purchase more government bonds. Currently, the SARB, the PIC has got state-owned company and government bonds of 660 billion rands, and SARB has got 41 billion, I think it's 41 billion rands of government bonds. There was a case study done by the IMF recently of 18 emerging markets which had implemented quantitative easing. They found that it had reduced the cost of capital and had no impact on the currencies. There was no withdrawal of capital from these countries by foreign investors. I just have to mention the ones I followed there was Guatemala and Ghana. The government in Ghana issued a COVID bond to address the crisis on favorable terms, and the Central Bank of Ghana purchased those bonds. So the Central Bank of Ghana was involved in directly financing expenditure of the Ghanaian treasury. And the same happened in Guatemala, in Indonesia. And the IMF concluded that this was a cost-free, it was a very, they said that many other developing countries should consider implementing quantitative easing. Now, the other thing that I've been talking about is that we can reduce the funding in the PIC to 50%. I'll explain what I'm talking about. There's two ways to fund a pension. It can be fully funded or pay as you go. Now, in a fully funded, it's a company, it can go bust, but there's no scenario where the government can go bust. There's no scenario where the government can have to pay 1.3 million public servants on the same day, because there'll always be teachers and nurses to make contributions to the fund. And The PIC has accumulated surpluses of about 340 billion rands over the past 7 years. And there is no reason to be accumulating those surpluses in a country that has high level of unemployment and poverty. There's another way of designing pension funds. It can be defined contribution, like you see in the private sector. What you put in is what you get. That's defined contribution. Defined benefit, it has no relation. You only get a percentage of your final salary. So when the share prices go down because of Steinhoff, nobody suffers. You get a percentage of your final salary. And when the share prices go up, you don't benefit. So for me, the GEPF is just government's way of funding its obligation towards the pensioners. So as I said, there's about 670 billion rands of SOE, state and SC debt. We could write off 670 billion rands and release 300 billion rands into the economy. And that includes cash of the PIC of about 140 billion rands. So we could release assets of 1 trillion rands from the PIC, and the fund would still have an annual surplus of 15 billion rands in terms of the difference between contributions and investment income and benefit payments. There is not one pensioner who would suffer. I just have to mention that the biggest contributory pension fund in the USA, they pay, I think, 2 trillion rands a year to pension benefits to Americans. That one is pay as you go. The money of the pensioners this year pays the money of the pensioners the same year. So also we've got a very deep financial sector in South Africa. It's got 10 trillion rands of assets in the insurance and in the retirement industry, and 5 billion rands in 5.9 billion rands in the banking sector. So I believe that we could have a minimum. Government has talked about changing Regulation 28 to encourage investment in impact or developmental investments. But I believe this is a voluntary thing. It will not release money. If we had a minimum legislated target or a deal with the financial sector, an accord or a compact with the financial sector, we could release unlock more than 500 billion, 700 billion rands, depending on where the target is set. So I believe that is something that we should consider in terms of impact or developmental investments. We must not use this money to finance ESCOM or SAA. It must be for primary investments that create jobs. Think about it. If you put money in ESCOM, it doesn't create jobs, it finances past investment that happens in the past. So there are other ways to deal with the ESCOM debt. So there is no spare capacity. I don't believe there are financial constraints in terms of a stimulus for this country. There is spare capacity and insufficient demand. There's no inflationary threats for the near future. There are institutional constraints in terms of state capacity and corruption. I believe that we must innovate and create temporary and ring-fenced public-private worker community institutions to dispense with the government. Now, what I mean with that, I have lots of debates with a friend of mine who used to be in the ANC. He's running for mayor of Port Elizabeth, where half my family stands. And he's a very conservative guy. And we talk about my ideas around stimulating the economy. And he says, okay, finally, I agree with you, Duma. And he's a businessman. I said, why would you want this austerity? Because you don't get business from the government. So he says, okay, I agree with you, but now this ANC government is what I have a problem with. So I said, why can't we ring fence, set up an institution whereby there's public sector, the private sector, workers, and the communities. They will evaluate projects based on agreed criteria, job creation. So if you have a community has a job creation project in New Brighton, they would go to this entity, which is a non-political entity, and they say, we have this project that we think can create jobs to build this and whatever, and it will create 1,000 jobs in New Brighton. Can you fund it? And they will evaluate stimulus projects under certain criteria. I believe that we need to temporarily bypass the government while they sort out their capacity issues. And finally, in terms of the stimulus, I believe that it should be spent two ways. I always talk about a basic income grant. My slides today don't have a basic income grant, sorry. But I'm a big believer of the basic income grant. We should spend the stimulus, half of it must be on an infrastructure that creates jobs, and half of it must be on the basic income grant. I believe we must have a dignity floor below which no South African would fall. One of the most painful episodes during this pandemic is when driving past my local post office and seeing hundreds of people in dehumanizing queues for this 350 Rand social relief of distress grant. That is proof. They went through all the bureaucratic hurdles to get that money. And you see young men, mostly men, maybe 85%, and young women who don't receive other grants in those queues. I think that we can introduce a basic income grant at the upper poverty level of 1,268. It will cost 500 billion rands a year. I do talk about how we can finance it. I've written in my columns as to how we can finance it. But two things I have to say is that a budget neutral basic income grant makes no sense, because you can't say of the 500 billion rands and you adopt a static accounting analysis that we must raise 500 billion rands of taxes, because that is not a stimulus to the economy, because it's not new money into the economy. So we must decide how much stimulus we want, and then we don't have to fund in the first year the entire basic income grant. That's number one. Number two, the basic income grant has benefits, direct benefits through the tax system. There's 75 billion rands of VAT, and a study by Deloitte said we'd claw back 25 billion rands through the tax system. And then the third aspect of financing it, if you don't look at it in an accounting point of view, is that there's multiplier impacts of the spending. So in local communities, in the townships, people are spending this money. The informal workers have income. The informal workers are also benefiting from this grant, and they're also circulating the money in the townships. So that creates jobs and has multiplier impacts. So you will get more tax revenues than you would have got in the absence of the basic income grant. And the multipliers that have been calculated globally by this World Bank economist called Ugo, what's his name? This Italian economist. It's between 0.8 and 2.5. So if you spend 1 rand on the basic income grant, you could get, in terms of economic multiplier effects, up to 2.5 rands more. And what people know is that low income people spend their money more than richer people who invest in stocks. And then the second one is infrastructure spending. Infrastructure spending pays for itself. It generates the income to pay for itself. Now let us imagine a perfect South Africa where the money isn't stolen like Eskom, like PRASA. But in theory, if the government spends, and the IMF says if you spend R1 on infrastructure, you get back 2.7 rands in terms of multiplier effects. So the economy creates the income to pay for itself. And before I go, I just have to tell you that in terms of the stimulus package from China after the global financial crisis, they decided, we want to stimulate our economy. We're going to build high-speed rail throughout the whole country. And if you had an accounting analysis of this project, it probably wouldn't have made sense. But they spent $300 billion on this high-speed rail. They built 30,000 kilometers of high-speed rail throughout China. And the head of the rail company was convicted of corruption at some point during the thing. He was executed, the project went on. So they execute the people, they condemn the people, but the project went on. And I traveled on this line between Beijing and Shanghai, and I can truly say it is one of the wonders of this world. And the benefits extend far beyond the financial and economic benefits. It brings together families, it connects the country. There's so many ways that when you're on that train that you can see that this is benefiting the economy. The people, the hawkers who are selling at the station stops, people throughout, it's just, yeah. So the last thing I want to say is that to stimulate this economy, we must create catalytic projects like that one in China that are going to stimulate the economy. In the presentation I was in before, we were talking about this guy who used to work at MTN in Uganda, and you're saying, you know, one of the reasons why Uganda took off is that they had a focus on technology early on. I don't know how true this is, but my point is that it doesn't matter what these projects are, as long as we choose something that makes sense for us South Africans to catalyze our economy. And you don't have to, it doesn't have to be well thought out. And I don't know, that's what I'm trying to say. So we have to decide what we want to do as a country and not have an accounting analysis of how this thing will benefit. You know, if we had listened to the World Bank and the IMF and all that who do accounting analysis, no, we must develop our people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Duma. I think you've said a lot. I was furiously taking notes. I must say though, when you spoke about the development in China in terms of the rail, the rail project, I just got excited thinking, you know, what government should really build a railway between here and Pampierstad, where I come from, so that, you know, when I go home, I don't have to spend so many hours on the road. It was just one of the things. But I think for me, Duma, what I there's lots of, I see there's questions already, and there's someone already agreeing with you around a recycled project. I think we get excited when we hear about projects and not really link them back. I think that it also begs the question to say, if every year you have to bring this up as an exciting project, what does it mean for your budgeting in the past, in the year when you developed this project? But for me, it's sounding like, and I guess I want to also just test it with you, that this budget was really for rating agencies to avoid us being downgraded, and not really as a forward-looking budget to stimulate economic growth. And I also wanted to just maybe you spoke about a multiplier effect, and I wondered if perhaps maybe you can help us the budget for the small business development in terms of township and rural enterprise would be one such thing that would bring about that multiplier effect, bearing in mind that sometimes, you know, you mentioned corruption, and when you talked about corruption and us, you know, painting a picture of an ideal South Africa without corruption, I chuckled a bit, because in the budget, there's 1.8 billion that is set aside to improve business processes in the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development. I wonder if we just took people to jail that steal the money, whether that would not be a better investment of our time and money than setting aside 1.8 billion to improve process. Just maybe perhaps if you could just expand a little bit around the 4 billion for the small business development, and whether you think it would yield multiplier effects, and then I'll take questions from the floor.
Well, this is a big topic, well, it's a hobby of mine. The lack of financing for small business. You know, how can I put it? I don't know where to start. So I did a report for Women of South Africa recently, and I do this, and I phone the banks, including my bank, Nedbank, and all of them, and I say, how much are you lending to Black SMMEs? And, you know, they give me answers in terms of the commitments in the financial sector charter. So the banks lend about 0.5% of their assets to Black SMEs. That is a shocking number. And the amount that they, I remember, was it Nedbank? It was 400, no, it was ABSA, 500 million in 1 year to Black SMMEs. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the numbers are pitiful in terms of the lending towards small SMEs. So I think first and foremost, before we talk about the public sector lending to SMEs, we have to find a way. I believe in quotas, you know. In the BMF, they didn't agree with me, man. We spent so much time discussing this employment equity, and I read this Norwegian model. There's this right-wing government in Norway back in the day, about 2006. He just got tired. I did quota, 40%, or I deregister your company, women, you know? And I've always believed in, told many BMF presidents in the past, Why are you not asking for quotas? Now, we need to do quotas for lending. They must sort out the problem. It is not our problem as to how to find the viable SMMEs. The Reserve Bank, it must be part of the licensing conditions that you lend so much towards Black SMMEs. And the same with the Norwegian companies. The government says, I don't care where you find them. It's not my problem. It's your problem where you find the woman. But you saw in Norway during that quota, they kept on recycling the same women, the things that we see here in South Africa, the same Black people. So that's number one. We have to get the private sector, which has got the most finance in the country, the most, most money is created through loans by the banks. So we have to get them to support small business. And the only way to do that is through quotas. We don't call it a quota. I don't know what you call it. You can call it a developmental window. Find a word, whatever you do. That's number two. If you look at what the government is spending on small and Black SMEs, it's 1 billion through CIFA. IDC does not lend to small business. I was speaking to Moemisi Mutrepe recently. When last did you get funding as the NEF? They last got funding in 2010. And that is a scandalous situation. The NEF should be getting an award that it has managed to recycle the money that it got for 10 years afterwards with clean audits every decade. And what more do they have to do to prove that they can lend this money? Because they haven't got a cent from the government for 10 years. I was talking to a board member, previous board member, she said, we're just living on collections and then we're re-lending the collections, and that is it's one of the saddest things that I've seen. So I believe, as I said in the presentation, we have to recapitalize our development finance. When I was with that Black Economic Empowerment Commission, we said you must segment the market according to the size of the enterprise. You must have the people who do their BE deals, that's fine. And then you must have the small and medium businesses, and then you must have the micro businesses. The reason for my focus on micro is that back in the day, I met the social and development minister of Ethiopia. I was with my ex-wife, and she told us that in Ethiopia, they have 1 million, I had dinner with them in Pretoria, we have 1 million beneficiaries of microfinance in Ethiopia. So in Ethiopia, microfinance is big business. So what I'm trying to say is that, what we said in the report is that you must segment the market and have different brands for different markets. And you must also have, what I can say, different industry, like the Tourism Equity Fund. There must be a proliferation of these funds. Let us not be shy to set up these funds. I worked in mining research. Let us set up a mining fund, because mining finance is specialized. And do you see what I'm saying? Yeah. And then I would appeal to everybody to read the second Auditor General's report on the stimulus package. And she documents all the money that was allocated towards small business. Now, of the 100 billion rands that I talked to you about, 6 billion rand went to these various funds that Paul was talking about to capitalize them. So that is what, so quote, BMF members must read it, yeah. Yeah.
Duma, we lost you there for a few seconds. We lost the last bit of your response.
No, I was saying that the report by the Auditor General on the second report on the stimulus package, I think it is required reading for every South African to understand what happened with the stimulus money. Yeah. She uses a different methodology to mine, but she presents it in a very nice way that is easy to understand. And you'll begin to understand all these equity funds, Smolanyana equity funds, what they are and how much money went to them. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Duma. I think let me not hog the stage and take questions from the audience. There's one around from Spongiseni Myeni asking, do investment pledges have any role in the current recovery plan?
That's an easy one. The first investment summit, okay, they had the largest investment pledge was the Venetia diamond mine by Anglo American. I can't remember the number. It wasn't even in rands, it was in dollars, US dollars when they took. But now when I went and looked, this is what I do for a hobby. I went and looked at this project. This project had started in 2013. The mine was finished. So why are they pledging the mine? Why are they pledging a project that is finished? You go to Venetia now, the mine is finished. Why were you? So they were padding the numbers with projects that had already happened, yeah. So many of the projects are not real, yeah. So I remember at the last investment conference, the one that was physical, I was talking to Vuyisa Ramakgopa, and we were talking about this recycling of the projects that the private sector does. Most of them are not new money. The Ford investment is not a new project, and it's a project that was announced long ago. Someone was telling me it was long announced that Ford would build the Amarok for VW. It's nothing new. Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah. So anyway.
Quite interesting. I mean, pledging an old mine. We all know the capital costs of running an old mine erodes profits. So yeah, one wonders what the thinking was there. Kuma Dube asks, what role does the relative economic sovereignty of the Asian tigers play in their ability to make decisions in comparison to our own economic sovereignty? Is that a concern on any level? Or is the opposition to the strategy you advocate for purely about not trusting this government to implementing it responsibly?
In MMT, there's this concept called monetary sovereignty. So as far as possible, you must borrow in your own currency. And you must issue your own currency because, like Greece, Greece can get bankrupt because it doesn't have its own currency because it was running the euro. So there are 4 conditions, and you must tax in your own currency and so forth. Now, this is very important for us because it allows us to monitor, foreign investors have got so much hold on our economy, and you have to protect your domestic sovereignty. So I did research when I was looking at this monetary sovereignty issue, is that the JSE, the stocks, the JSE has got a market cap of 17.5 trillion. Foreign ownership of the shares is about 40%. And I believe that we must reduce that number. And one of the ways we must reduce that number is that most of the JSE has got nothing to do with South Africa. The market goes up and down because of the behavior of 10 cents, which accounts for, in fact, there's 2 companies, it's Prosus and Naspers, which account for 1/3 of the JS's market capitalization. And those companies have got nothing to do with South Africa. Companies like Richmond. So these companies are paying havoc with our capital flows and our currency, and we have to improve money. I would ban all those dual listings that have got nothing to do with South African economy. That's number 1. The bond market, during the crisis, they've reduced their bond holdings to 30% of our bond market. And the banks have taken up those bonds, South African bonds. So I just think that, that is the framework. We have to improve our monetary sovereignty. We must have capital controls that money just doesn't. So when you implement this project that I'm talking about, you must be able to anticipate the response of the foreign investors, and they mustn't have too much sway over what you decide. And in Asia, they found the mechanisms to control these foreign investors. They don't dictate whatever happens. And the last thing I want to say is that when you saw the Asian crisis, you saw countries like Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, which had loosened the regulations towards foreign investors. They were the ones who were most affected by the crisis in Asia in 1998. And what the joke that was made by one economist called Ha Jun Chang is that the more you see our Asian economists studying in the US and believing in the deregulation of financial markets, that is what causes our instability in our economies. Yeah. You're on mute.
I'm on mute. Yeah, so I was Just checking to see if there's any questions. Bongseni, you asked about government support for small business. I think Duma, we may have answered that. It's what are your views on government support for small business and the role of small businesses in stimulating economic growth? And then there was a question around foreign direct, the contribution of foreign direct investment in our economy during the period of post-GAY. I think that was when you were showing us the different periods. So maybe you can take those questions, Duma.
Okay, so if you look at all the fast growth economies, including China and Asia, foreign direct investment accounts for a very small part of the economy. What I say is that foreign direct investment is the icing on the cake. Foreign investors follow domestic investors, and if domestic investors are withdrawing from the economy, they won't come. So as a rule of thumb, and based on looking at all the stats, especially in Asia, of total investment in the economy, 10% is foreign investments, 90% is domestic. And South Africa, we've got a deep capital markets. Most of I'm not saying we mustn't have foreign investment, but if you look at those countries, there are conditions under which you have foreign investment. In China, they put them in one certain part of the economy, which was in the southern regions, which they wanted to develop. And there were conditions upon those foreign investors. I must just mention a very funny story. We were in Guangzhou, which is the third largest city in China, and we're meeting the mayor and the head of the Communist Party and all this. And it was during the trade war with Donald Trump. And he says, the trade war is against a region of Guangzhou. So that region of the city, the Silicon Valley in Guangzhou, is where all the companies are. And he says, he was just rubbishing it off. He said, this is not the Chinese economy. This is where Huawei head office is. It's here in Guangzhou, but it's not going to kill our country. So that is a country that has got monetary sovereignty. And throughout that trade war, I knew that China will come out first in terms of that trade war because they've got monetary sovereignty. And that's what we should aim to achieve as a country as well.
Thank you. I think there's a question, but before I take your question, Mafeno, I just because it's you, Duma, the minister spoke about fast tracking the public procurement bill, but he didn't give any timeline. So I just wanted your thought. I mean, we know that with regards to that, we are saying that government must spend or put their money where their mouth is with regards to Black economic empowerment. So I just wanted your view in terms of what your thoughts are around.
You know, I stopped following that one. It's been going on for so long. And I mean, I've been to so many meetings at the BBC around this issue. I just said, no, I'm tired. You know?
Yeah. There's no timelines being tabled. So even though he says they're working hard, without a timeline, you can continue to work hard to no end. So
one thing you must watch is that there was a commitment made in the last two sonars, 40% procurement from women-owned companies. What is happening with that? I'm going to follow up on that one to find out what is happening here. Yeah.
Great, thanks. And maybe we'll bring you back to just have another discussion on it. Mafeno says there's a complaint that the money is being circulated by the stokvels are not being harnessed correctly to be truly beneficial to the Black economy. I think you just wanted to know what your opinion is on that one.
You know, there used to be a lot of discussion. And what's that guy, the stockbroker, Andile? He used to run the Stokvel Association. What's his name? Andile Mazwai. Yeah. And he had a big profile and he used to talk about it. And I think the whole issues around stokvels, it's fallen out of the public domain. And I haven't been following that issue lately. So I don't know how much money there is in the stokvels, but we should find a way. I think the first thing you want to know for a project is to find out what is out there. It's a huge research project that we should be investing in. And how can we improve this thing? And I remember once I was invited to do a presentation on economic opportunities to former people who were friends from Mkhonto Wesizwe. And they had the stokvel, which they'd had since exile times, and they wanted me to advise them on economic opportunities and where they could invest the money of their stokvel. You know, I can't remember what I advised them at the time, but these things are, you know, these things are huge in our country.
Yeah, there's another question which I'm gonna ask you. Anele asked, why is the government not weakening our currency in order to make imports more expensive and kickstart our industrialization? The mining sector and the fiscals could have increased their earnings if the currency did not strengthen.
You were breaking, but I think I understand Anele's question. You know, Mpo, I've been a big believer in the depreciation of the currency. And I used to joke to my friends that, you know, if I was in charge, the first thing I'd do, the rand would go to 50. And then, and let's see what happens. There's an economist at Investec who's been writing about this. His name is Michael Power. He even did a PhD on it. So me and him, we agree on this. But South Africans, the middle class South Africans, their oil price, the petrol price, they just don't see it. But the point, let me just tell you one thing. South Korea's industrialization, it started in 1960. The first time they depreciated the currency, they didn't do it well. The second time they depreciated the currency, they did it very well, and the country took off. Now, our country, 1930, when we left under apartheid, when we left the gold standard, you know, after the Great Depression and the collapse of the gold standard, there was a huge depreciation of our currency. Our currency, the South African pound, against the currency, the pound, yeah. And then that stimulated the boom in mining. It's the biggest boom that you've ever seen in South African mining history. There's a book about it here. It's called Digging Deep. It's written by a lady called Jade Daventop, A History of Mining in South Africa. She explains how the currency depreciation that happened in the early 1930s, there was also, what happened is that the dollar also strengthened as well. And that created this, so the growth from South Africa lasted for 4 decades. And the surplus from the mines financed industrialization and what you saw, the apartheid economy. So from 1930 to 1970, it created a massive boom. Now, China did it as well, but they've stopped doing it. As I said, Chinese, they start, then they stop, but they've stopped manipulating their currency now. They want it to become a global reserve currency, so they've stopped manipulating their currency as well. Yeah. So these are some of the things that you must include at some stages in your development. They're never permanent measures. If you want to give it, I said you have to kickstart your economy somehow. And the only way austerity can succeed is if there is an external windfall, and the currency depreciation is one of them. Yeah. But you need a reserve bank that's going to accommodate it. You must remember that there are base effects. The inflation increases in year 1, and then in year 2, it decreases sharply. And if you want evidence of that, look at what happened in 2001, when the currency went to 14 and the inflation rate went shooting up. And then the next few years, inflation went down rapidly. And that is what resulted in our lower interest rates at the time. Yeah. My battery is going. I just need to get a charger.
Oh, yeah. So we've got about, okay. Yeah, I think Duma's really putting in thoughts around what we can really do, a different way that government should look at in terms of just funding the economy. And I think in terms of just looking at the linking between the SONA, which is really the statement of what needs to be done, and the budget, there seems to also just be gaps there. I think for me, concern is that GBV allocation has not been done. And Duma, I wanted to to maybe in your closing remarks. We've got about 8 minutes.
Okay, so on the GBV, I just want to say one thing. This is a hobby of mine. I've decided there's a document called the Estimates of National Expenditure. I go after each budget, after I've done all the speaking arrangements, I go into lockdown to understand the budget for about a week or 10 days. So this time, what I'm going to do, I'm going to look at this GBV allocation. You know, I spoke to the Deputy Minister of Women. She tried to explain it to me. I wasn't hearing her. But what I'm trying to say, I spoke to a lot of people. Yeah, so what I'm trying to say is that if it isn't in the budget, it doesn't exist. So there's a 900-page document. We are searching. First you say GBVF, then you say gender. And what I've seen in terms of the allocation is that over the last 3 budgets, they've been making the same allocation of 15 million rands towards the GBVF Council. And the council hasn't been appointed. If you remember, this first was talked about. Remember the president, the women, he was at the WEF, and after Uyinene Mrwetyana was raped and murdered. And in Cape Town, he pledged 1.6 billion rands to GBVF. And I've been following this GBVF 1.6 billion with the Budget Justice Coalition. Busi Sibeko, you should also invite her to speak. So she's the chair of the Budget Justice Coalition, and she's been following it together with me, and we can find no record of that money being spent. And the 4 Whys report was released by Brenda Madumisa and them, and they gave government an F in terms of the allocation of this money. There was an emergency action plan on GBV that was supposed to spend this 1.6 billion. So I'll be following the 1.6, I'll be following the 21 billion as well. And yeah, I just got tired of it because you keep making the same promises and nobody can explain. And what I can say is that a lot of the money was supposed to be spent by the Department of Justice in terms of the court system and so forth. But you see that the Ministry of Women has got no budget allocation and so forth. But I'll get to the bottom of this and I'll share the report with you guys here.
Thank you, Duma. I think let's take one last question. We've got 5 minutes before the session ends. Mduduzi would like to know more about the impact of, I think QE is quantitative easing.
Yes.
In South Africa, in the South African economy. Part of the reason given is that the constitution doesn't allow the Reserve Bank to buy primary bonds. If QE were to be implemented, how much should it be and what impact would it have?
Okay, so on the legislative, you know, there's Chris Malikane, who lives not far from me. So we meet quite often together at Bedford Center where I live. So Chris did an article some years ago, a year or 2 ago, the professor, around this. He read the law and he came to the conclusion that no, the Reserve Bank misunderstood their own law. And he proved it, and he showed the statutes that show that there's a limit of about 300 billion rands that they can lend to the government at no cost. Yeah. So I'm not sure whether the article he wrote about it, you know, and so there is no legislative. I'm not a lawyer. I trust what Chris said, and the Reserve Bank, after they said that, they stopped saying so. You know, and when the governor appeared at WITS, he stopped saying that again. You know, so I should imagine that he shut them up. Yeah. But now, in terms of you must read the IMF Fiscal Monitor, October 2020, which does a case study of QE. And that is the one that I was referred to. And the Bank for International Settlements also did a report, I think in April, May or somewhere there, around QE in emerging markets. So the last crisis, QE only happened in rich countries. And the difference with this crisis, it has happened in emerging markets as well. And I think what happened in South Africa, it actually brought down bond yields significantly, because remember there was a dislocation in our markets in March, and they intervened with very little money and it brought down bond yields, I think, by 300 basis points, if I can remember well. So it was successful in the limited way that it was done. And yeah, so that's what the IMF found as well, that ours was successful and many other developing countries was successful, and they encouraged other countries to do the same. Yeah. And let me just say one thing, there's no logical reason. Stephanie calls it our public money, our sovereign money. There's no logical reason why there should be a debasement of the currency through inflation, depreciation, or a sudden stop of capital flows from investors. The evidence doesn't show that.
Thank you. I think let's end it there. There's lots more questions. I think I can imagine this is probably your 10th talk today. So I think let's end it there. Duma is a friend of the BMF, and if you have additional questions that you would like us to pose to him, I think he would indulge us if we were to send him a mail with some of those questions. So I would encourage you to then just email head office any further questions that you may have, and then we'll also send them to do. And Prof. Chris is also a friend of the BMF, so maybe we one day we
talk about QE.
Sorry?
Prof. Chris must talk about QE.
Yes, we could. Although I was just thinking we could ask him for his article and also share with the other articles that you've referred the audience to, the Duma. I must say, we've come to the end of the session. Duma, thank you so much. You're always available for the BMF. I can recall a number of times that I've certainly called you to ask you to do something for us, to come and present something, an analysis, and you've done that. We really appreciate that, and we really appreciate you. And let me say thank you to the audience as well for being such an engaging audience. I must say, I know that BMF members are top of the cream, but the questions that were coming through really showed that we do read. There's often sayings that when you want to hide information from Black people, put it in a book, put it in a paper, write it down. But this group of Black people certainly read and are interested in our economy. So I'm really encouraged. I think we should continue. What I would also want to encourage is that let's look at the budget speech again. Let's see what it is that we can put together to engage government around some of the proposals, around some of the things that they would need to do for implementation. Because it's one thing to say we're allocating 11 million for job creation, employment, and it's another to be realized to actual outcomes that we see. And as a BMF, I think we're well positioned to give that guidance and help government to get those things done. Thank you so much. Thank you, audience, for being so engaging. Good evening.